From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Another notable debate of late was in Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis tangled with his Democratic challenger, Charlie Crist, who is kind of the Florida chameleon. He was a Republican, and then he was an independent, and now he is a Democrat. And what is interesting in this race is that DeSantis is up by a healthy margin. The Real Clear Politics average puts it at 11 points. And so the takeaway that most people had from this debate wasn't what DeSantis said about November, but what he said potentially about 2024. Listen to this.
You're running for governor. Why don't you look in the eyes of the people of the state of Florida and say to them, if you're reelected, you will serve a full 4-year term as governor. Yes or no? Yes or no, Ron? Will you serve a full 4-year term if you're reelected governor of Florida? It's not a tough question. It's a fair question. He won't tell you.
We did not agree on the candidates asking each other questions. Governor, it's your turn.
Well, listen, I know that Charlie's interested in talking about 2024 and Joe Biden, but I just want to make things very, very clear. The only worn-out old donkey I'm looking to put out to pasture is Charlie Crist.
Kim, what do you make of this? I mean, on one hand, I think this is kind of a lame gotcha question that politicians who don't have a whole lot to say throw at their opponents. On the other hand, it was a conspicuous non-answer from Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, and that, of course, is the answer, right? The fact that he wouldn't commit to running a full term means that he is debating a 2024 run. And, you know, Ron DeSantis, anyone who doesn't know that this is something that is on his mind is a voter who probably isn't paying much attention. I mean, I think that when you look at that lead that he has in the state, it is voters who are voting for him knowing full well that it's in the cards that he might be going somewhere else. And that's what actually made this debate really interesting to me, is that kind of like the Pennsylvania debate, there were a lot of people watching it from outside of Florida. DeSantis has obviously, in the last couple of years, really defined himself on the national stage, made himself better known. Charlie Crist tried to use some of those positions that DeSantis has really jumped on as a way to undermine him in the state. There was a lot of talk about transgender care, critical race theory, his decision to send undocumented migrants up to Martha's Vineyard, a lot of the things that have been flashpoints that have made Ron DeSantis known across the country. But this was an opportunity in some ways for Ron DeSantis to widen that audience. It was, in theory, a debate about the governorship of Florida, but it was also a broader forum. People were taking another look at this guy who could be a contender in 24.
The contrast on the question of serving a full term, though, is California Governor Gavin Newsom. And he was in a debate on Sunday and was asked by a moderator if he would commit to serving all 4 years. And he said, quote, yes. And Monet, what I find most notable about this is everyone seems to think that Ron DeSantis is running for president. Everyone also seems to think that Gavin Newsom is running for president. And personally, I would rather have a candidate who refuses to answer the question than one who says, I will commit to serving my full term in a way that looks pretty, frankly, unbelievable.
I agree with that. I think that DeSantis knows that if he were to say, no, I'm fully committed to the state of Florida, and that's my entire focus right now, that if he does decide to run, whoever he's competing against in a Republican primary, and particularly that might be Donald Trump, would be playing that clip again and again and basically pinning him down as a flip-flopper on that issue. And so he wisely decided to give a non-answer. I'm giving himself flexibility to make that decision later down the road. I think he's in a very different situation from Gavin Newsom because Newsom potentially could be in a position of wanting to challenge, basically to succeed President Biden if he opts not to run in 2024. But I do think that it's a different thing when the president is from your own party, basically to say that he's thinking about running, because Biden hasn't even suggested yet whether he intends to run. And so you've seen a lot of the Democrats who are seen as potential contenders for that nomination be a little bit more coy because they want to leave space for the president to make his own determination about whether he's going to run for re-election before they start publicly suggesting that they might be candidates. So I think that's part of the reason why Newsom decided to be very clear and say, hey, I'm not going to run. But certainly he would have no problem flipping on a dime. And I frankly think there are lots of past presidential candidates who have been in that situation, running for re-election shortly before beginning their presidential candidacies. And if they do end up changing their mind and basically reversing the statement they had made saying they weren't going to run, people quickly forgive them for that if they think they're the best candidate for the ticket. So I think it's a somewhat moot question for all candidates in the end.
One more debate that's worth a few words was in New York. And here's a clip of Republican Lee Zeldin going after Governor Kathy Hochul on the question of crime.
The first day that I'm in office, I'm going to declare a crime emergency and suspend cashless bail and these other pro-criminal laws because there is a crime emergency. My opponent thinks that right now there's a polio emergency going on, but there's not a crime emergency. Different priorities that I'm hearing from people right now, they're not being represented. From this governor, who still, to this moment, we're halfway through the debate, she still hasn't talked about locking up anyone committing any crimes.
Okay.
Anyone who commits a crime under our laws, especially with the change they made to bail, has consequences. I don't know why that's so important to you. All I know is that we could do more.
Kim, we've talked about Governor Hochul's record on crime in past podcasts, but it will be interesting to see the Real Clear Politics average here shows Hochul up by about 6 points. And it will be interesting to see in ensuing days if this focus on crime at the debate has any effect on the polls that are going to come out in the next few days.
Monet made a really good point when he was talking about the Fetterman-Oz race and noting that for as much as Fetterman's health was in the headlines last night in that debate, the way Oz really has closed that gap has been to hit on some big issues. Crime is one of them, and New York is another place where Zeldin is really managing to close the gap by hitting this issue and hitting it hard. And as you heard in that Hochul response, where she admitted we could do better, it has put her on the defense. She's also now running ads suggesting that she's going to be better on crime than he would be. Just a few of the things that he went through last night in that debate, he hit her for opposing further revisions to the state's bail law, hit her for refusing to roll back some changes that were made to the parole system, to the juvenile system. He talked about the rising crime on the subway system and how little has been done to take care of that. And he reiterated his promise that right away, were he to win, that he would remove the Manhattan DA, Alvin Bragg, who has really been one of these progressive prosecutors that's led the way in releasing people back out onto the street despite very big problems with crime and despite their records. There was a lot of talk, too, about some statistics. Well, murders are slightly down for this period in New York. The rate of serious crime in the state has continued to go up. That includes robberies and rapes and felony assaults. People do not feel safe there. And there were some other important flashpoints in this debate, including some accusations he made against her, pretty tough, about pay-to-play accusations that she didn't have any very good answers for. We'll see how many New Yorkers were tuned in. This is a tough state for Republicans, obviously, but the fact that this race is so close and the fact that this debate got so much attention is a statement on just how far Lee Zeldin has come.
One final thought here is on the timing. We're still roughly 2 weeks from Election Day, and according to some data at the U.S. Elections Project, 11.7 million early votes have been cast already. And you can dig down into some of these specific states. So I looked at the numbers yesterday in Pennsylvania before the Oz-Fetterman debate, and it said that about 630,000 mail votes had already been cast out of about 1.3 million that voters had requested be sent to them so far. And so that's a rate of about 48%. And if you look and compare this against the midterm turnout in the 2018 Senate race, it looks like maybe something like 10% of voters have already cast their ballots before this Fetterman-Oz debate even took place. And Monet, I'm all for easy access to voting and to ballots, but at some point I start to wonder whether we get to a point where there are a lot of people voting before the campaign has even finished playing out.
I agree. I do think that the massive expansion of mail voting that took place in reforms to elections in 2020 are going to cause a permanent change to the way that we conduct elections in this country, and not necessarily a change for the better. We've seen people continuing to vote by mail in similar proportions to 2 years ago, despite the fact that nobody can really say that there's a huge significant health risk from waiting to go to the polls. People just find it a lot more convenient to vote by mail. but that means that so many more people are voting early than anything that we've seen in past election cycles. And so I do think that you're going to have outcomes where there are pretty significant developments in some of these races. And as we've been saying, the Fetterman performance in the debate on Tuesday night does count as a significant development that could potentially change some voters' minds. But because we've had such a huge proportion already cast their ballots, we're basically going to have voters deciding who to back based on completely different sets of information from other voters. And it seems to be a complete change that I don't think people foresaw when all these states decided to make it easier for people to vote by mail and automatically send mail ballots to everybody. And I do think that some of these red states that did sort of tighten the parameters of this type of voting were right to do so, because I think there's something very healthy about having Election Day in-person voting be the norm.
And that's not to say that there are not reasons to vote absentee. And the last time we discussed this, I got a letter from a listener who was living in Estonia during, I think, the 2020 election. And I've been keeping this letter in my back pocket until the next time that this subject came up. He says that in mid-October, he was in Estonia. He went to the embassy to submit his ballot, and he was told that it wouldn't count because it takes weeks for that mail to get to the U.S. He says, I was told that I should FedEx my ballot if I wanted it to count. I thought about it, but decided that voting is a fundamental right and I should not have to pay. So I gave it in at the embassy. And lo and behold, his ballot was not counted because it was too late. And Kim, I don't dispute that there are a lot of people who may be overseas, maybe just out of town, maybe sick, maybe in a hospital and can't get to the ballot box. But again, looking at the data from the U.S. Elections Project, it says that so far to date in the 2022 election, there have been 54 million mail ballots requested. And that doesn't mean that all of those people who request a mail ballot will ultimately fill it out and turn it in. Some of them might show up at the polls anyway. But that is a huge fraction of the people who will end up voting in this election.
Yeah, some of us, that would be me, are old enough to remember the days when people like our reader, people who were working overseas, or for instance, people in the armed forces, that was the last thing that happened, right? Is that you might get a really close election. And then there was a lot of focus on the fact that a lot of states, for instance, have a provision that allows for a couple of weeks after the polls have closed for those ballots from our servicemen and women and overseas citizens to come in. And it wasn't always the case that they would be definitive in any kind of final election result, but there were some races where it was. I also grew up in the state of Oregon, which was one of the first to embrace mail-in voting. I thought it was a terrible idea then. I still think it's a terrible idea. I mean, put me on record, and I know that a lot of people won't like to hear this because they like mail-in voting, but I think we should only have election day voting, except for those which we always did have. Almost every state has provided the option over time for people who truly weren't going to be able to get to the polls, whether because of a medical problem or because they were going to be traveling and out of state. You could go in, you could get your reasons, and you could get an absentee ballot. I think that this movement that you have described is very concerning. It means people are less informed about when they're casting their vote. I've also believed this notion that the most secure way to do voting is when it is done under the eyes and the noses of election officials in person on the day. And that one of the reasons we have a lack of trust in the system is that people can come up with all kinds of thoughts about why mail-in voting can be less secure and why it's a problem. And it's led to a lot of the theories that people have and the lack of trust people have in the voting system, how they're all counted at the end as well, too. So, let's make it simpler. Let's allow people to be better informed, and let's go back to one day of voting.
Thank you, Kim and Monet. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.